ገንዘቡ የት ነው? ብሩ የት ነው?
Welcome everyone to the Where is the Money for Feminist organizing webinar hosted by AWID. Today we'll be speaking with a number of different representatives from funding agencies and those who have had plenty of experience within the feminist resourcing ecosystem. We'll be marking the launch of the Where is the Money for Feminist organizing survey and discussing why we need to be looking at the issue of how and where money is moving, but also the state of feminist organizing worldwide in the current context. With us, we have some amazing speakers who are very excited to have them. We have Cindy Clark, who is the Vice President of Global Operations at Thousand Currents. We also have with us Vanessa, who is a Program Manager at the Black Feminist Fund. Next, we have Althea Anderson, who works with the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation as a Program Officer on Gender Equity and Governance. And last but not the least, welcome to Lisa Mossberg, who is the Strategy Coordinator for the Global Strategy on Gender Equality and Women's and Girls' Rights at SIDA, and SIDA is the Swedish International Development Corporation Agency. So thank you everyone, welcome, and thanks for joining us, and looking forward to the conversation ahead.
I'm going to invite Cindy and Vanessa into the space because this is the sort of first part of this conversation. It is going to be a little bit about the question that we are asking, where is the money? And particularly from folks who have done this work for many, many years in many different, avatars within this, what we call feminist funding ecosystem. So I'm going to start with Cindy, actually. I'm just going to dive in, and I would love for you to share some of your reflections. So before you joined Thousand Currents, you led AWID's Where is the Money program, including the first analysis around the state of resourcing feminist movements. That was back in 2003. For those who are curious, that's a long time ago, 21 years ago. Am I right? Oh my gosh. What has changed? And we know we've gotten older, but what has changed or remained the same since then? And do you feel there is a need for an analysis on where is the money now and why?
Great. Thanks so much, Gopika. I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with everyone here today, because absolutely, it is incredibly relevant. And, you know, that saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same, also feels kind of appropriate in terms of resourcing. Just to situate the context of that history. So imagine it's the early 2000s. It's about 5 years since the big Beijing World Conference on Women. Lots of donor interest that had been galvanized around that conference. But AWID was hearing a lot from members that it's like, they're not so interested anymore, or funders are pulling out of our countries. We're not seeing the same level of support. And so initially, it started as a research into fundraising. So, particularly what are fundraising strategies for transnational women's rights work. We did dozens of interviews and presented this initial research in the 2002 AWID Forum in Guadalajara. And it was really clear that we had struck a chord. There was just so much frustration. Like, funders are saying one thing, they're saying women's rights are a priority, that absolutely, but the money's not there, or, and we're actively seeing them pull back. So with the clarity that there was more to understand, that's when we really decided, and at the time I wasn't even working for AWID, I was at Just Associates, and we had done this collaboration on the research, but AWID expanded the work and decided to do a global survey to really compile data directly from women's rights organizations. that was important to understand, what is the budget size? How has your budget size changed in the last few years? Who concretely is funding you? So that gave us helpful insights around who was able to access bilateral funding. We're seeing that the vast majority of survey respondents were getting funded from women's funds, even if small amounts, like they were reaching large swaths of the respondents. So that was really important insight. And it was a very kind of critical contribution, I think, in that moment. Thinking about some of the things that have changed. What's great is that, with a 20+ year kind of perspective, you see the cycles. There are ebbs and flows. So while I think we're going to talk today about some of the significant challenges of this moment, let's not forget the challenges that we have also seen in the past. So it was post 9/11, it was the war on terror that was being waged in the name of women, and what that was doing in terms of the landscape and funding flows. We had the big aid effectiveness process that was going on, so that was really changing how official development assistance coming from, bilateral and other governmental agencies. So, feminists were trying to make sense of that. Of course, later on, there was a 2008 financial crisis and trying to understand the implications of that. So, many crises over periods of time. But when we look now at I think some of the changes in the landscape, women's funds back then, there were not as many, like they were not as big and as strong. So that as a community, they've really blossomed and come into that, into their role. I think we see comings and goings. There's new funder interest today, and some have left the field. And I think that just underscores the reality that, we can't take our gains as a given, right? We know that politically, and it's the same in the resourcing landscape. And I think there's some new, maybe others will also speak to this, opportunities in the moment. Individual funding back then was just kind of yes, a lot of membership fees were there, but high net worth individuals were few and far between. And now, we talk a lot about being in the biggest transfer of wealth in history, right? So individuals and the possibility to move people with significant wealth is kind of, I think, a new moment. And there's a lot of discussion in philanthropy. I know, again, the gap between rhetoric and practice is real, but the talk around trust-based funding, core support, how much research is out there saying that core support is really the way to do that? So, those are some of, I think, the trends or the shifts that we can build on. I just want to say a couple of words about why I think a resource like the Where's the Money survey is key, because there's 3 reasons that I want to underscore. One is that, like it or not, data is really important to help us make our case. So the survey data is one piece of understanding the dynamics and debunking some myths. So 20 years ago, we were hearing, everybody's funding, women's rights groups. We don't need to worry about them. Well, no, actually, we could see in the survey data that, the median budget size was 25,000. The other big myth was they want to be small. They like being small. No, we could say, actually, they want to grow. They've got big ambitions. There's more that they want to do. It helps us understand dynamics across different regions, different sectors of organizing. And now there's been, I know Vanessa's going to speak a bit to this, there's a wealth of much more in-depth kind of research and analysis of different segments of organizing that I think is really valuable to understand the landscape. And we know that data is important for our funder allies. So when the Netherlands created the MDG3 fund, they said one piece of important kind of information that they used in making the case was having this survey data. They were saying gender equality was a priority, and yet, women's rights organizations, especially in the Global South, were not getting the resources. The second reason why I think a survey like this is important is it keeps money, sorry, I'm going to slow down, on feminist movement agendas and in our conversations. If you like movies like Encanto, that we don't talk about Bruno, there's we don't talk about money. It's a little uncomfortable. We have funky personal relationships to it. It can generate feelings of competition. And so it was, I think, important just to break that taboo. And we got to talk about money, because you know what? It is not just a technical exercise. Fundraising, is really like, we're thinking about resource mobilization for the movement beyond our individual organizations and needs. And so I think that's a really important conversation and muscle. And to get groups over the feeling that I'm underfunded because I'm a bad fundraiser or I write bad proposals. It's like, no, you're underfunded because there's a system that devalues and deprioritizes your work and contributions. So it's got to be a collective political process that shifts that. And, you know, sure, do we want to do some capacity building and strengthening? You know, can we improve our fundraising? I'm sure we can, but let's be clear about what the main issue is. And just to note, this work started in the context of a program on building feminist movements and organizations. When AWID was asking, what does it take to strengthen, you know, feminist organizations? What we heard from members was, we're starved for resources. So that became kind of a critical entry point, that conversation. So last, this is important, going back to Gopika, what you said at the beginning, the survey is never just about a survey and having data. It's an input for sense making and a collective conversation with funder allies from different sectors, with various folks from within the movement, to do sense making. So the very first survey that we did, you know, I remember being in a room with like 25 people. It was the first time I'd ever talked about money and fundraising with somebody from a bilateral agency, with private philanthropy, with women's funds, and with a whole bunch of feminists in the room, hashing it out. Because the other thing is, it's easy, we don't understand necessarily each other's institutions and dynamics. So for me to understand what's possible for Lisa at SIDA and what's not possible. And so then strategize, because it's this kind of sense making that's really going to help us navigate the shifting context and the challenges that we are facing.
Oh, thanks, Cindy. What a way to kick us off. I saw Vanessa with some agreement while you were talking, and you know, it really struck me when you talk about what struck me was the change in individual wealth as well, because of course capitalism made its way through the last 21 years to also create that wealth inequality, which is also a huge, I guess, dilemma for a lot of feminist movements even today, about, oh, is that where we need to go now? The people who under-resourced us, we need to go to them for resources. So also very interesting questions around how we can deal with some of these sort of like, I mean, they don't go together like objectively, but we do need to start thinking about what are the choices that we make, and also who has the privilege to make those choices around politically, you know, political choices about money. And thank you so much for talking about money in a political way. I am now going to come to Vanessa, because in March 2023, which was 20 years later, the Black Feminist Fund published Where is the Money for Black Feminist Organizing? It showed that 59% of Black feminist organizations had never received core funding. Barely 1.5 years later, a lot has changed in the world. You know, when we were prepping for this call, you said, I don't even know like what, you know, how so much has changed even since that, just 1.5 years ago. So do you have experiences or examples of what is the state of Black feminist organizing now? And what are the critical challenges that you're seeing at Black Feminist Fund and the opportunities? So over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Gopika, and thank you, Cindy. It was really important, I think, for you to ground us in the kind of longitudinal distance that we've traveled in this work. So thank you for that. Greetings, everyone. I am Vanessa Thomas, and I lead the philanthropic advocacy at Black Feminist Fund. For those who aren't aware of us, we are the first global institution of its kind, funding and supporting Black feminist movements that are fighting against a myriad of systems of oppression, whilst rehearsing another world that is affirming, joyful, and just for us all. Thank you, AWID, for hosting this really important conversation and embarking on another Where is the Money survey. It feels timely, I think, for a multitude of reasons. And Cindy, I'm happy you went first for lots of reasons, but mainly because you kind of outlined a lot of the positives which we need to take stock of and I think are really important. but unfortunately, my outlook isn't as positive. We're at a really critical juncture. We're seeing literal and metaphorical fires taking place everywhere, from the most recent Hurricane Beryl, which was a very, very severe hurricane so early into the season. Prolonged conflicts, untenable living costs, and state-sanctioned homophobia. Lots of us know in philanthropy that the revolution will not be funded. However, with billions of dollars, philanthropy can either help us fight and resist this tumble towards authoritarianism and patriarchal hegemony, or do little, too late. Black feminist movements are really at the forefront of transformative and courageous work, working across intersections that benefit the entire community. It was Black women and organizing in Brazil that helped defeat the fascist Bolsonaro, and the anti-femicide marches of 2019 in Kenya, which helped grow the phenomenal resistance we've seen recently with the finance bill protest. Despite this world-building work, Black feminist movements receive the tiniest of tiny percentages in all of philanthropic funding. Gopika has referenced this, but in 2023 at Black Feminist Fund, we published Where is the Money for Black Feminist Movements? And it's widely known that Black feminist movements are grossly under-resourced. However, this 5-chapter call to action, I guess, is the first comprehensive analysis on this. The report explores perspectives and insights from close to 400 Black feminists, philanthropic contributions to Black feminist movements, as well as the kind of illicit funding flows which are actively hampering and harming Black feminist movements. So to give you a snapshot, 0.1 to 0.35% of foundation giving globally went to Black women, girls, and gender expansive people. And it's never good starting any statistic with a 0 point anything. 0.22% of climate funding went to Black feminist organizations. 0.27% of funding went to Black people with disabilities globally. 81% of Black feminist organizations do not have the financial resources to meet their goals. And over half, at 53% of Black feminist groups, do not have funds available for the next fiscal year. So this report was last March 2023. So by those stats, many of the groups that we interviewed and had conversations with didn't have funding to take them to the next fiscal year. This is really damning. The global funding system has a deeply rooted, racialized, and gendered trust gap. So in a year and a half since this provocation, I am encouraged by the beautiful ways that typically Black and other global majority communities have kind of continued the tireless work of rehearsing liberatory futures. But to be honest, I'm disappointed with how little has changed across the board and how deep anti-Blackness and patriarchy permeate everything, everywhere. The time to earnestly fund Black feminist movements was yesterday, and still philanthropy does little. So to give some examples, well, we're now over a year into the war in Sudan, with thousands killed and over 10 million people displaced. I read just today that Sudan has the largest internally displaced population on record. You'd not know this because philanthropy has been largely silent. We saw many, and rightly, we saw many emergency and crisis funds pop up and mobilize for Ukraine. And despite the world celebrating the 2019 uprisings, which saw the ending of the Bashir dictatorship in Sudan, in both the mainstream news cycles and in the philanthropy sector, Sudan has been invisibilized once again, demonstrating how little African bodies matter. Last year, alongside our network of Black women and gender expansive people in philanthropy, BFIP, we mobilized $1 million and counting, which is moving to Sudanese feminist organizations who are doing life-saving work. Sadly, this expendability can also be seen in philanthropy's wavering and fear as a result of the recent rulings against affirmative action, most recently with Fearless Fund, so going over to the States now. Organizers and organizations are being asked to be race neutral or to amend their racial justice language. And in light of this, it was encouraging to read the statement from MacArthur Foundation reaffirming their commitment to racial equity. And I really earnestly hope that other foundations remain steadfast and meet this moment with the solidarity that it requires. Because whether we look globally, regionally, or locally, the bastions of white supremacy and all of its associated ills are working overtime. Conservative foundations are actually in lockstep with the anti-rights movements that they support. The Global Philanthropy Project estimates that global anti-rights funding is at about $1 billion. $1 billion. And we're seeing the repercussions of this in the Ghana Human Sexual Rights and Family Values Bill, which, if passed, will be one of the most punitive and draconian of all of the homophobic legislation which is out there. And then we go across the border and we're seeing queer communities in Burkina Faso and Nigeria facing violence and, again, more punitive legislation. I'm encouraged by activist funds like ISDAO and UHI, the latter being one of the top 20 global LGBTQ funders, because they're doing really critical work funding the resistance to these anti-rights gains across the continent. But this really needs to be a groundswell. And just to wrap, and I guess to toot our own horn at the Black Feminist Fund, beyond the research, we're really trying to model the type of philanthropy that we'd like to see. So in our 3 years, we've moved over $15 million and we've invested in 72 movement partners across 44 countries. Despite our newness, so we officially launched in 2021 and we started our grant making a year later, we are now in the top 20 foundations of funders for supporting LGBTQ-led organizations. The work we do and the work of others in our ecosystem is, of course, really commendable, but to have a fighting chance, we really need a constellation, if you will, a constellation of funders moving money abundantly. Black feminist interventions offer the solutions to a world in crisis, and continuing to ignore or undervalue and under-resource Black feminist movements will literally cost us everything. Thanks, Gopika.
Thanks, Vanessa. Wow, this was a really powerful introduction. I think what you talked about in terms of the racialized and gender gap, I think that was really important to articulate, and also given like what both of you have discussed around the histories and where we are, obviously, even if there has been a plethora of research and evidence and data, we're still not there. And it's maybe some of us are and some of us are not. Most of us are not. So I think it's really, really important that you pointed this out, especially around how the crisis funds have been blooming, depending, and that is also a geopolitical choice from funders. And yeah, I think it's really, really important to look at this in a more specific way when we think of specific groups that still are unable to even, probably the data's the same or even worse than what Cindy was talking about from 21 years ago. So thanks so much for highlighting that. Thank you to both of you for your interventions. We're going to come back to you in the question and answer space. We already have a number of questions coming in for you. But for now, thanks a lot. It's given us a lot to think about in terms of context setting. And we're going to move on to another part. But before that, we will play another short video from one of our Where is the Money, I guess, champions. And let me not say champions, but someone who agreed to do a little video for us on Where is the Money.
Where is the money?
My name is Davy Leeper O'Malley. I've been working in feminist resource justice movements my whole life. I'm Cambodian and American. My issues have been about getting resources to activists. The Where is the Money research has been really important to me. It's definitely had an impact on my understanding of feminism and my life. It also was really important because that first research also really made clear how little resources were going to young feminist groups, young feminist activists. And because of that research, FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, was created. And during my time at FRIDA, we recreated Where is the Money. We did our own research using the same methodology to look at where is the money for young feminists. And we still need this research regularly for any issue so that we can create the funding mechanisms we need so that we can advocate for the resources that movements need. And my key message to funders is listening to those who are leading our movements, to those who are leading equality.
Where is the money?
Yes, so that was the former co-director of the FRIDA Fund, a young feminist fund that supports young feminist organizing globally. For the next section, I'm going to invite two more of our speakers. I'd like to call in Lisa Mossberg and Althea Anderson. Lisa and Althea, welcome to this discussion. I'm sure you heard who came before you. So lots of things to think about around the context. But I guess this section is really about another aspect of where is the money, which is the how. You know, how are resources reaching activists and your specific roles as allies of the feminist movement. So I would love to actually start off with you, Lisa, around what SIDA has been doing. And, you know, SIDA's role, I mean, given SIDA's role as an important ally and core supporter of feminist movements, can you help us make sense of what is going on with overseas development aid, so ODA, at this moment? And how can we continue to make the case for resourcing feminist movements to be critical, really, for our democracies to thrive? And yeah, what is your, you know, it would be lovely to see things from your viewpoint and your context. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. It's a challenge to explain all that, but I'm pleased to be part of this important conversation. I'm very well aware many organizations and movements experience a substantial decrease of funding right now. We hear it here today, and this research is so important to spell it out. And we as SIDA, we hear it from our partners. And we hear it at a time when we know that there is so much to do to protect human rights and gender equality and democracy, inclusive development. And in a time when we know that there are strong forces pushing anti-rights agendas for conservative family values against women's rights, against LGBTI rights, SRHR in general, and abortion in particular. So I will share some reflections on funding trends and narratives, and I have a couple of suggestions. First, ODA from many donors right now is decreasing due to strained economies and due to the fact that other policy areas are being prioritized in country. The Swedish government has decided to have a flat level of development cooperation for a 3-year period to create predictability. The level we have today is 0.8% of GDP, as compared to 1.4% of GDP in 2020. Important, though, is that gender equality remains a priority with focus on SRHR and women's economic empowerment. But this goes for Sweden as well as other donors. Large amounts are devoted to Ukraine. Yes, that's a geopolitical choice. And to humanitarian support, work to alter climate change and also to cover in-country refugee costs. We are living in a time with many interrelated crises and larger humanitarian needs than for many years. And that means less funding for long-term development cooperation. It's unfortunate, and it's a reality. So that's why this conversation is so important. Secondly, starting from the Swedish example, the Swedish government spelled out a new overarching policy in December last year, And there it says that the prioritizations are efficiency, transparency, country-level cooperation, and concrete results for people living in poverty. And this approach is rather similar to some other major donor countries. And it might sound provocative, those priorities, and I would like to elaborate a little bit around this demand for transparency and concrete results, if that's a new thing, and why. It does not have to be understood as a distrust in relation to our partners, in relation to the work you are all doing. And it does not have to mean going back only to project support. It can also be understood as related to the importance of keeping the public, the taxpayers in donor countries, informed about where the money goes and what they contribute to. And that information is necessary to keep people motivated to support that development cooperation is prioritized and to ensure a part of GDP is devoted to development cooperation. So showcasing transparency and providing concrete results is a way of countering a narrative about ineffective development cooperation or corruption or money disappearing or not providing results. And that's a case we need to make together, us, SIDA, and other donor agencies in bilateral donor countries, and you partners, feminist movements. Thirdly, and as explained in this meeting very clearly, out of the chunk of ODA, development cooperation funding, we do know that very little, less than 1% of both philanthropic and development cooperation funding reach feminist movements. And as explained by Vanessa, the funding that reach Black feminist movements is even less. I think we all agree that a shift is needed. But I would also like to spell out that there are some positive trends in this field. It's as reported by OECD, the proportion of ODA that is directed to civil society is increasing year by year, and that is good news. And also, but maybe some more slowly, the percentage or the part that reach women's rights organizations. I am pleased to report that at SIDA, we have a positive trend now. We have an increased proportion of disbursement that reach women's rights organizations from 2.7% in 2022 to 3.2% last year, 2023. And that is related to making the case for women's rights organizations and feminist movement building, spelling out the fact and figures that there's evidence that funding to women's rights organizations and feminist movements is efficient, the most efficient way to contribute to gender equality. And that there is a long-term impact, elimination of violence, more women in parliament, economic justice, that can be achieved, but not without advocacy, organizations, movements, and protection for activists. So the recommendation on how we together can hold the line or push the line is, I mentioned briefly in the beginning, first, that a Swedish priority, at least, is to move more towards country-level partnerships and not global partnerships. So to work on country level with donor embassies might hopefully be an efficient way of also getting access to funding, but also for strong partnerships for sharing knowledge and insights and conduct joint advocacy for legislative change and protection for human rights defenders. So that's maybe a shift. Be aware of this shift. But also, next recommendation, be prepared to present results and impact. It's there. It's both by making the case for movement building, but also by showcasing how you contribute to shifts in legislation, provide protection for marginalized groups, enhance diversified political participation or economic empowerment. It is needed by your partners and to convince citizens in donor countries, and explain your role and contribution to the broader field of democracy, civil society, protection of human rights, and protection and use of the human rights mechanism. Next one. Neither gender equality or social justice or climate justice are challenges that can be solved one by one. And this is no news for anyone, but the importance of working broadly and together is, I think, something we all need to keep up, and as donors, we need to prioritize. In relation to donors' strong interest to follow the money in terms of ensuring partners have systems in place to plan and follow up funding. Being scrutinized might be frustrating, but having transparent systems in place is also necessary for accountability, not only to donors, but maybe more importantly in relation to organizations, members, and grantees. And this is no news for you, for feminist movements. But I recommend to use the demand for systems for internal control and as an opportunity to grow and create organizational sustainability, including transparency and accountability to members. Among donors, that's a recommendation to myself, my colleagues, and my peer donors. We need to be complementary to each other. If we don't have the amounts needed, and if we can't provide as long-term and flexible funding we would like, we need to coordinate among ourselves to make sure that we meet, or to the extent possible, meet the needs of feminist movements together. We need also to coordinate among ourselves, to use each other's assessments, and not to make partners go through assessments and audits multiple times a year. We need to serve movements in that way, and we need to continue making the case for movement building, of course, explaining the long-term impact. Last but not least, we need to continue supporting both these concrete results that are there, clearly, support organizations and movements, and also research like this to showcase the reality, and to resource advocacy to shift the narrative, and of course to also prevent the influence of anti-rights movements and to safeguard feminist knowledge as well as feminist activists. So that's my take.
What a take it is. Thank you so much, Lisa. I saw Althea also ready to sort of jump in from there, and really want to appreciate how you've contextualized this from a country perspective, which is, you know, giving out ODI, because often as Global South feminist activists, that side becomes invisible. And just the fact that you said 0.8% of GDP compared to 1.4%, that's a huge shift in the last 4 years. I mean, a very, very short amount of time with impending, protracted, existing crisis across the Global South and with marginalized communities. So very, very important reflections. And you know, always we can't have our donors here without talking to us about showing results, which I think is really important. But it's great. I think it's also you know, a little bit of give and take always with all funders. But I really appreciate your candidness around what does it take in terms of making this case and continuing to make this case in a way that doesn't leave movements, you know, invisibilized or forgotten. And so really appreciate allies like yourself who are within the system. Oftentimes feminist movements move forward because of allies within broader systems, and we don't often acknowledge that. So thank you so much. I'm going to go over to Althea. Althea, the same question to you really, but from a different perspective, because you work in the philanthropy space. You've been sort of navigating the complexities. You know, Cindy spoke to us a little bit about, you know, the increasing number of high net worth individuals as opposed to 21 years ago. and you're really looking at how to get resources to activists directly. So could you share insights into what the sort of opportunities, but also, I believe, the fault lines within the philanthropic space, whatever you can and whatever you've seen from where you're sitting. And yeah, over to you, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, Gopika. And appreciation to AWID for the opportunity to join this conversation, share my reflections, as you said, on the opportunities and the challenges of ensuring that feminist movements and activists get the resources they need to thrive. So again, I'm Althea Anderson. I'm a program officer in the Gender Equity and Governance program at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I've been in philanthropy for 7 years now, and I co-lead our work on global reproductive equity and women's economic empowerment. So similar to Lisa, I want to first commend AWID on launching this new Where is the Money survey. It strengthens the evidence that's needed for one, to link issues like gender-based violence, economic justice, sexual and reproductive justice, and inclusive governance processes to feminist movements that are often best placed to address these issues. And two, to clarify the financial and philanthropic resources and relationships that movements are asking for. Those are very important. AWID's updated Where's the Money report adds to an expanding body of evidence and analysis, including, Vanessa mentioned, Black feminist funds, Where's the Money for Black feminist movements, the research that Davey mentioned in the video that Frida commissioned on Where's the Money for young feminists, and Shake the Table's Light the Way report for philanthropy on the power and promise of feminist movements. So this expanding body of evidence is essential for funders, specifically program staff, to make the case to our leadership to invest in feminist organizing as part of our gender equity and justice commitments. Also for our colleagues in issue areas that don't often center gender equity, like climate, technology, governance, and economic development, this evidence helps us to make the case that feminist movements and activists are well-positioned actors in these ecosystems that have long-standing efforts to advance these issues, and they require flexible long-term support to maintain the gains they've achieved, counter oppositional forces that we've all mentioned, and to continue this work in a way that centers their own physical, mental, spiritual, and economic well-being, both collectively and individually. Since I tend to gravitate of a critique of philanthropic practice that really limits the extent to which we value and partner with feminist and justice movements, I'm going to take the cue and start today with opportunities as far as the type of funding that is necessary, how the money flows, and where the future and new money will come from. And for each of these, I'll start with opportunities, but I will definitely share like a fault line that the field must contend with. So starting with the type of funding, it should be no surprise, we've mentioned already that we've heard from feminist movements that they need general operating support, flexible funding, and multi-year support to advance their organizing and reporting requirements that are light touch and in formats that are useful for activists to document their own learning and what progress looks like for them. So that is a baseline. We all know this. At the Hewlett Foundation, we have deepened our partnership with feminist movements, and we are listening and have strived to ensure that our funding relationships are structured in this way. In addition, at Hewlett, we offer our partners organizational effectiveness support that is in addition to core support that allows feminist organizations to invest in movement strengthening in areas like digital security in the face of mounting pressure from anti-gender and anti-rights groups. In addition to that, recently our communications, legal, and IT teams have introduced specialized funding that will further support our grantee partners who are threatened by shrinking civic space and constraints in the legal landscape around equity and justice-centered work. So these longstanding and new funding opportunities have been informed by our partnerships with feminist movements as a commitment to mutual learning, as well as by peer funders who have consistently invested in grassroots women's rights organizations and feminist movements for decades. One such community is the Gender Funders Collab, which recently launched our 10-year anniversary impact report. This funder learning community has contributed to expanding resources for feminist movements, including the creation of the Equality Fund, and has pooled funds that have helped leverage over $350 million over the past decade. So now I'm going to move on to how the money flows. Ideally, feminist movements receive funding directly and structured in ways that are responsive to their expressed needs and demonstrate trust and a commitment to mutual learning. However, we know that direct funding is really hard to come by. And so within indirect pathways, through funding intermediaries and fiscal sponsors, how do we ensure that money flows in ways that integrate feminist funding principles? Within private philanthropy, I've seen an evolution to indirect funding practices that expand flexible support to feminist movements, but this requires transparent communication channels and clear accountability mechanisms. For example, in my own grant-making practices and those of my peers at Hewlett, we have increased our core support to feminist movements directly and through women and feminist funds. And there are cases where we continue to fund through intermediaries and fiscal sponsors. In these instances, some of the conditions that I've put into intermediary funding relationships are ensuring that feminist activists are at the table from the beginning of proposal development processes, that they're on the calls, that there is language justice, and that everyone can participate in deciding how the funding should be spent, who gets to decide how the funding is spent. And so these are some of the practices that are really important to ensure that if we're going to continue to fund indirectly, that the feminist movements are making the decisions on how that money is spent. We aim to collectively establish clear expectations around sub-awards that are can be structured as multi-year core support with, again, light touch reporting. The aim is to ensure that there is budget transparency and equity, which means that the majority of the total grant amount is allocated to sub-awards for movement actors. Also, it's crucial that there are accountability mechanisms in place to ensure that all parties live up to the feminist funding principles and equitable funding practices put in place. That takes a lot of work and time. But with that, a concern around how the funding flows is the trend towards the conflation and co-option of language that may seem harmless, but has real consequences on who receives money. So many of us work in the gender equality space. We use terms like gender equity, equality, justice, power sharing, shifting, decolonization, and empowerment very fluidly. But what are the funding implications of this fluidity? How does this fluidity mask real power and financial inequities between historically well-resourced gender equality organizations and historically under-resourced feminist movements? And how will we contend with these inequities? It's an open question. So my last set of reflections are about ensuring that feminist movements and activists get the resources needed to thrive, is where future and new money for feminist organizing will come from. Gopika, you mentioned, yes, heading to these new actors in the field. So let's start with the traditional actors. It's been hard to track if new money is coming into the field from governments, private philanthropy, and bilateral donors. Part of the reason it's difficult to track if it's a net gain is because while new funders and new funding are coming into the field, other funders are retracting and shifting their priorities, which my colleagues have mentioned. The shaky ground and lack of predictableness from traditional funders are parallel to new money coming from corporate philanthropy and high net worth individuals. And some of these new funders are looking for guidance on how to focus their giving, both who to give to and how to give, which is a potential opportunity for new funding partnerships and transformative funding practices. And there are potential new funding pathways in response to the troubling political climate and anti-rights efforts to constrain existing funding pathways. So for example, as Vanessa mentioned, the US Supreme Court's 2023 ruling against affirmative action has constrained funding for racial justice, but also emboldened racial justice activists within philanthropy to fund alternative pathways to fund feminist movements and justice activists. Even the anti-rights coordinated efforts and attacks have emboldened funders to collaborate across issue areas to fund grassroots activists to push back against these threats. But an unanswered question is who will receive the future and new resources and how the funding will be structured. Even as a private philanthropy funder, I am still learning how best to network with these new actors who have committed to advancing gender equity and justice, and advise these new peers about the feminist movement actors that we partner with and the feminist funding practices that we've integrated into our partnerships.
Thank you both. And we're getting comments about how candid, thanking you for open and candid conversation. And I would add to that because I think it's really, sometimes, when you said, Althea, that, oh, we all know this, that there's, that there are feminist funds. Actually, a lot of folks don't. And I love that you were able to just remind us, because oftentimes when we are in this world of resourcing and funding, and we just step out for a moment, one realizes how these conversations are also sort of like in a specific space, and really appreciated your challenge. I mean, I think this is something we're seeing as well around conflation and co-option of language in the field of resourcing, but also in many other spheres that we are working on, whether it's, also feminism, who is a feminist, who is considered, a feminist, and what they should believe and do, right up to, multilateral spaces. We're seeing this and bilateral spaces, really, this conversation. So thank you for framing it like that. And also around the existing funders pulling out. I think that's a critical thing that you have pointed out, is that, people may be seeing, okay, new funders coming in, but that's probably disproportionate to how much of, I would say, big resources are going out. On the fiscal, it's interesting, on the fiscal and intermediaries, we've been having this discussion in AWID as well about how in some regions it works, and in some regions, it just actually creates more risk for activists. This is something, in our particular region in South Asia is also, we're seeing that very explicitly around how money moves or cannot move across the region. We've seen what happens in Afghanistan with the complete shutdown of funds moving to the country. So a lot of important things to really think about that both of you raised. I really like what you said, Lisa, about being in service of movements. And I feel like that framing is so important for everyone, really, in the global space, but also in the transnational space, that where we are talking a lot across countries about feminist organizing and what it means to organize in the current highly risky context. So thanks to both of you, and we're going to come back to you as well in the Q&A. We're all going to come back together. So thanks so much for sharing your thoughts in this section, and we're going to move over to our next section. We actually, and I didn't mention this at the start, we were supposed to have Sachini with us. Sachini is a part of RESURJ, which is a young feminist collective organizing with Global South feminists. And unfortunately, Sachini could not be here because they're unwell. So we're sending Sachini good recovery wishes to you, Sachini. But instead of Sachini, we also have our own Kashya, who is from AWID, who also was going to share some reflections around her own observations around the work of the financial realities of feminist movements. And this section was really going to be unpacking that. And Kashya will also be sort of talking a little bit about the Where is the Money research and about the survey. So after that, we will open up for questions. For now, we'll go to a short video. I think it's yeah, it's our last one for the day, but also to give a shout out to Natalia and Amarello Productions, who have really supported us with all of the amazing videos and creatives for the Where is the Money survey, an amazing Global South-led and based creative collective. So over to our short video of another activist sharing their experiences around resourcing.
¿Dónde está la plata? Where is the money?
আমি জয়া শিকদার সম্পূর্ণ অর্গানাইজেশনের প্রতিষ্ঠাতা। আমি ব্যক্তি জীবনে আমি জয়া শিকদার একজন ট্রান্সজেন্ডার ওমেন। আমি বাংলাদেশে ট্রান্সজেন্ডার মানুষের অধিকার নিয়ে কাজ করি, যৌনকর্মীদের অধিকার নিয়ে কাজ করি এবং নারীবাদী আন্দোলনগুলির সঙ্গে যুক্ত, এবং আমি এলজিবিটি আইকিউ মানুষের অধিকারের কথা বলি। আমি দাতা সংস্থার কাছে যে সংবাদটি দিতে চাই সেটি হচ্ছে যে দক্ষিণ এশিয়ায় এই ট্রান্সজেন্ডার মানুষরা অনেক মার্জিনালাইজ। এই মার্জিনালাইজ হওয়ার কারণ হচ্ছে তাদেরকে পরিবার থেকে বের করে দেয়, এছাড়াও রাষ্ট্র তাদেরকে রিকগনাইজ করে না, যার জন্য তার অধিকারটা সঠিকভাবে রাষ্ট্রের কাছে পৌঁছে দেওয়া এবং এটাকে বাস্তবায়ন করা, যার জন্যই অর্থনৈতিক সহায়তা এখানে দরকার। রিসার্চ প্ল্যাটফর্ম ইজ এ ওয়েস্ট মানি। তো এখানে দেখা যাচ্ছে টাকাটা কোথায় আমাদের জন্য, যেখানে যেখানে দাতা সংস্থা তাদের টাকা ধরে নারীদের জন্য 1%, সেখান থেকে 8% নারীরাই তো অনেকটা টাকা নিয়ে যায়, সেখান থেকে আমরা তৃণমূল পর্যায়ে নারীরা আমাদের জন্য কতটাই টাকা থাকে। তাহলে আমরা যে আমাদের জন্য যেসব প্রকল্পগুলি তারা হাতে নেয়, যেসব প্রজেক্টগুলি বাস্তবায়ন করে, সেখানে আমি যদি এইচআইভি প্রোগ্রামের কথা এক্সাম্পল নিয়ে আসি, এইচআইভি প্রোগ্রামের জন্য এত কাজ হচ্ছে, এত কিছু হচ্ছে, কিন্তু দিন শেষে একজন সেক্স ওয়ার্কার, একজন ট্রান্সজেন্ডার মানুষ, তার হাতে দুটো কন্ডোমই চলে আসে, এই কন্ডোম ছাড়া সে আর কিছুই পায় না। তাহলে আমাদের জীবনমান উন্নয়নটা আমরা কোথায় দেখব, আমাদের মান উন্নয়নটা কিভাবে হবে, যার জন্যই অর্থ এখানে প্রয়োজন।
Yeah, thanks to Joya for sharing, I think, a very compelling narrative of her own experience with funding and the actual ground realities of what gets funded and who funds. So I will go over to you, Kasia, now. A little bit more from, I mean, you've also been really working in like analyzing and looking at the resourcing feminist ecosystem for many years. And I wanted to ask you, can you share from your, I mean, our work at AWID, but also your own experiences, what do you think is critical for donors to know right now? And what is the kind of information rooted in feminist lived realities that are important for the Where is the Money research to lift up? And yeah, if you could also share a bit more about the survey, that would also be welcome. So over to you, Kasia.
Thanks so much, Gopika, and welcome everyone. It's really great to see such a turnout at this webinar. Really appreciate your time. To respond to your question, Gopika, about what is important to lift up for funders. So AWID has been doing resourcing feminist Where's the Money work for over 20 years now, as we heard also from Cindy about the origins of that work. And I just want to emphasize that this is very much informed, rooted, led by what we're hearing from our members, what we're hearing from our partners. The same goes for Where is the Money research, Where is the Money survey. You know, we've been having a lot of thoughts whether, you know, this is indeed something that we should pick up. You know, this has been picked up by so many movements already in different geographies, which really makes us happy because we really want to see those in-depth analysis and activists really running with their own research, like the Black Feminist Fund did, and so many other groups and movements, which is amazing. But we also heard very clearly that there is a need for a new global analysis. And before we even started that work, we held consultations, we had pilots, we engaged with over 100 members, activists in different territories from different movements, and no way I can do justice to what we heard from them, but I just want to leap up 3 things. The 3 things that came up was claiming power, claiming power of activists as experts on how money moves and who it is reaching. As Althea and other speakers said today, money is hard to track. And this is how you track the money. This is how you really tap into the lived financial realities of feminist movements and bring out evidence and data and stories that are rooted in those realities, because we see and we have the data from funders, analysis of how ODA is moving, how philanthropic funding is moving. It's super important, and we need to have that. But to have a full picture, we also need to have data and research really rooted in what feminists are experiencing. So this is this kind of shifting power, claiming power as experts in practice to really visibilize and lift up those resourcing realities. And in that way, also show how what really works and what doesn't when it comes to moving money, both for those founders that have been long time standing with us and those that are joining right now. And also building on that, it's also further kind of politicizing and expanding the notion of where is the money. It's not only about who funds and how to get those funding, but how this funding actually moves, and also act on the promises that we have heard over the last decade, of the promises of shifting power, of really resourcing intersectional feminist organizing. Is money actually reaching those groups like sex workers, like transgender feminists, like indigenous feminists, like Black racial and racialized feminists, like gender expansive people? How are they sitting in the ecosystem? And this is and the work and what we're hearing is not encouraging. And the survey and this work is our chance to bring out those stories, to bring out those voices, and experiences to the front. And just to, a small anecdote, when we were developing the survey, and I know for some people it really seems long, and I appreciate that, I hear that, I would still say it's half the length of what we had previously in 2011 for Where is the Money survey. But what we heard from our members and activists that we engage with, that we really need to have a strong section. We need to have questions about power shifting, about really actioning the commitments, the political commitment. So I just really want to emphasize this co-creation and responding to what we heard is needed, even if it means that we have more questions that over making the survey more sweet and short. But now moving into the survey as such, and just sharing with you, some of the key things that would be great to know, and really encourage you to respond. The survey is open until the end of July, and we really, really hope that you can find some time to respond and share your lived realities with us. I just want to remind ourselves that the survey is for groups, organizations, and collectives, whether you're registered or unregistered, whether you're receiving funding from external funders, or you're not receiving those funding for many different reasons, and you mobilize resources yourselves. Of course, the survey is aimed at organizations that identify as feminists, work on women, girls, on trans and gender diverse people rights, and those that are based in any region. And also just something I want to emphasize is at this point, we're not asking for responses from funders or from individuals, but you still have a huge role to play to make sure that, that this survey is disseminated as widely as possible. So if you're a funder at this webinar, please make sure to share the survey within your networks. If you're an individual activist, I'm sure you're connected with collectives, groups, and movements wherever and however you organize. We really invite you to help groups to respond to that survey. And also on our side as AWID, we try to offer as much technical support as possible. The survey is available on the platform called Kobo. I'm just going to very quickly share my screen with you so that you can see how this looks like. Yes, it's here. So that's the survey. You have a chance to select your language at the top of the survey. The survey is available in English, in Spanish, in French, in Portuguese, in Arabic, and in Russian. We absolutely recognize that that's not the language justice we would hope for. There are so many other languages that are out there, but this is what we can manage at this moment. Still, if you need the translation support to fill the survey, we're here for you. Please reach out to us. It has 5 sections. It has questions that are mandatory and they are marked with a star. And there are questions that are not mandatory. They are without the star. And you can also save your responses. You don't have to fill the survey all at once. You can save your responses. Save draft. And you can come back to this anytime you need. Your responses are stored here. You can see that I have been doing this many times because I have like 10 different versions of the survey. It's not the survey is not short. I think it takes we estimated it takes approximately 30 minutes to complete, but you don't have to do this all at once. So that's the way that you can work around it and come back to that. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. And what would really help you to fill that survey is that before embarking on that, like, please have your financial information with you. That means the size of your annual budget of the last 3 years, as well as those funds, as well as kind of, a top line analysis, who were your main funders and what kind of funding you received, whether this was core support, whether emergency response funding. And just to call you, we are not asking about the exact numbers. The responses are standardized. So it's not about being detailed to every zero and to every single comma, but of course we need to be able to produce this analysis and do justice to that. We need to know the top line numbers you're working with your budgets. And also just to tell you where we are at that moment. At the moment, we are at about 500 responses. So we really need you to come on board and share your lived realities and experiences with us. The last time we did Where is the Money survey, we were at I think close to 1,000 responses. So it would be really nice to at least match that level of that time. And for more information, I invite you to visit AWID Where is the Money website and our frequently asked questions. They're available in those 6 languages. And for any support, you can contact myself and Dea. We are AWID's Resourcing Feminist Movements team, and we are here to help you with any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Kasia. Can you tell that we're excited about the survey yet? So at this point, we have about 15 minutes left, which we're going to use for a little bit of a Q&A. So thanks so much, Kasia, for sharing. I'm going to invite all our panelists and speakers to turn their cameras on in order to answer some of the questions. We have so many questions pouring in, and for those who are able to click on the Q&A box, there are some questions being answered live, which is really fantastic. I think Cindy and Vanessa, you've been typing some thoughts in there, and I'm actually going to start with you because there is a question for you. I'm going to maybe invite other reflections as well, but this one is particularly to Vanessa and Cindy. Many movements in the Global South have been asking funders to step up, and years later, we see that funders have pulled out when spaces close, leaving movements to suffer. At the same time, funders have discussed supporting and centering movements and partnering for years. So there is a gap. What do you think is needed to have these conversations become generative, and what is the barrier? I'll also pop it in the chat for you if either of you have any thoughts, or actually it's a pretty good question for anyone, but thought I would get a response from one of you first. So this is the question. I'm putting it in the chat for everyone. Yeah, so happy to hear any pearls of wisdom. Vanessa, here on mute.
First, Cindy, and then you can follow. Both of us were typing away, so you put our responses in the chat, so I won't labor the point. All I will zoom in on is I really hear the frustration, and the onus is absolutely not on movement partners across the Global South to tap dance and prove your worth. The transforming and world building work that you've been doing doesn't need to be stated. It's clear. I think there's a real responsibility, and I put this in the chat, but I think there's a real responsibility for those self-stated kind of progressive foundations to really do the heavy lifting and organizing amongst ourselves. And that's a big focus at the Black Feminist Fund. And I think it's something that we should all do a lot more of, because it's not, like I said, the onus isn't on movement partners. And to give a short anecdote, so you can hear from my accent that I was going to say I'm British. I'm not British. I won't claim that title, but I was born in London. And a lot of us have been watching what's been going on in continental Europe with interest. And just before the results of the most recent election, there was the fear that it was going to be the far-right party that would win, and what would that look like? And the left, from various extremes and moderations, organized. The only reason why Le Pen's party didn't get the majority votes is because the left actually came together and organized. So when I talk about philanthropic advocacy, that's what I mean. Progressive foundations, self-stated progressive foundations need to be organized. And that might look like workshops, that might look like speaking on events like this, that might look like private meetings with trustees or senior leadership, but we need to get together and be organized.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Vanessa. Cindy.
I mean, I totally agree with everything Vanessa shared. I won't also belabor what I responded in writing. I will say that a question that I have, the point, Vanessa, you were making about not putting the onus on movement partners, I agree. And at the same time, it's like, how do we also ensure that when movements want a direct connection and they want to be saying like, this is really messed up, that can be facilitated in a way that's not like instrumental or tokenistic. And also, so, not to shout out, but like the AWID forum space, right? Where are those convening spaces and opportunities to bring folks from different kinds of institutions together, because otherwise I do have a little bit of skepticism. There are so many of those philanthropic, affinity groups, and so much space and resources that philanthropy spends on itself. And it's like, if it makes a difference, okay, but constantly wanting to kind of criticize, like, okay, is that the best use of the resources or not?
Ooh, thanks, Cindy. Challenge accepted, I hope, for funders listening. So we don't have much more time, but I would love to highlight this question. Althea, it was something that you brought up. So the question is, while I was listening to Althea, I was particularly drawn to your point on the co-option of language. We continue to hear terms such as feminism, decolonization come up in various spaces, but depending on the interpretation, they then at times become detrimental to our work. Also, when it comes to the current anti-rights wave, we continue to see how our language has not only been co-opted to suit certain narratives, but at times weaponized. So my question then is, how do we communicate differently? How do we then ensure that our messages land and do not draw criticism, but instead begin to pass our messages across to current funders or even new pools of funders who might be aware of the issues, but do not understand the jargon we use, because in most times we tend to speak to each other. Ooh, that's a really powerful question. Also, would love Althea and Lisa as well, if you have any thoughts on this, would really invite your reflections on this question. So, and
Thank you, Gopika.
maybe quick one, sorry.
And Emma, I'm a slow typer. I'm on like line 3, but I'm trying to answer the question. So I think I said I'm happy to do this live. The main point that I want to make, and then I will try to answer pieces of this, is that the primary responsibility of how to communicate should not be on women's and feminist funds. So I think that part of the relationship, and I will speak specifically, because UAF Africa has asked this question, is the relationship between women's and feminist funds and private philanthropy and corporate philanthropy and bilateral funders, is that we are all funders. And so if we are committed to mutual learning and if we're committed to allyship, as feminists working in this space and allyship to feminist movements, is how do we take responsibility, given our own privilege and power, to be able to do that interpretation. So one, to say, like, when we are talking about these issues of decolonization, if we are talking about these issues of attacks on trans community and what does that mean in the gender equality space, it is my responsibility as someone who works in private philanthropy to explain that to my private philanthropy colleagues and across peer funders, to the extent that I understand these. And to the extent that I don't, is to continue to be in conversation and to learn from other funders who, again, from their vantage point, understand these terms in a specific way. I think that is, in addition to the funding, it is this learning aspect and this accountability in terms of the philanthropic advocacy we're doing as funders. I really have tried to stress this in the 7 years that I've been in private philanthropy, is the philanthropic advocacy in some ways is equally as important as the funding we're doing. Because as we see, money comes and goes, new people come into the field. So this constant work of trying to share what feminist funding principles are. What does that mean, in technical grant-making practices, why the language actually matters, explaining it to our leadership, to our boards, is essential. That is part of my job. And Emma, shouldn't be like your job. And when there are problems, you come to me and then I try to, help collectively to problem solve that. The way in which the anti-rights community has co-opted the language is so obvious. And again, it is the responsibility of philanthropy to understand that, to not be baited, and to figure out ways to fund feminist movements as the actors who are really the ones who are going to move the transformation forward. I mean, that really, it is hard work. I think at some private foundations, it's harder than others because it really depends on how your organization is structured, to what extent you are not just accountable and serve grantee partners, which are, are becoming at Hewlett more feminist movement actors, but also like, to what extent are you accountable to your leadership, to your boards, how that relationship is structured. And if it's much more hierarchical, then the work that is required to continue to make the case is much more difficult. And some organizations, fortunately, it's not so hierarchical, and so that work is somewhat easier. So, and I hope I've answered the question, but I can go on.
You absolutely have, and I think it was better to do this through speaking than writing. So thanks, Althea. Lisa, we have a few more minutes left. I would love to hear your reactions to this question as well.
Maybe just adding on the very relevant comments of my colleagues. I very much agree, of course, that we together need to make the case and present that it's not about being nice, or it's not, it is evidence-based what we're doing, and that the results and impacts are there, and sometimes not measurable in traditional ways, but in other ways, and to also be open to support that methodological development work and so on. That's one part of the story. But another part of the story, when it comes to ODA from bilateral donor countries, is that we will never think, I can't really see, because there was a good question in the chat, how can we connect the national political agendas from bilateral donor funding, the trends, because it is very dependent. And I think my answer is no, we won't, because ODA is part of countries' GDP and dependent on national political agendas. So, and that makes it even more important, of course, for all of us to make the case, what is relevant, the case for good funding levels and relevant use of ODA. So that's part of the question.
Thank you. I'm really appreciating the candidness and openness of this conversation, mainly because it's time to do that. And I'm so glad that all four of you have just leaned into that space. I can't believe we're out of time and we have so many questions in the chat, but I would just love to lift up some reflections. And one thing I'd maybe offer is if we can collect these questions as AWID, and if anyone would like to respond afterwards, I'm looking at our panelists to see if you could, that would be great, because we could share it back with everyone who participated in the webinar, because there are so many thought-provoking questions here. Just a couple I wanted to lift up, which I think are also going to be useful closing, because what you all spoke about around coming together, as Cindy said, that, the AWID forum is coming up in December. The registration is open for those of you who are still thinking about coming. We hope that funders really step in. Of course, we don't have to tell the funders here, but we hope that funders really consider resourcing their grantee partners to attend the AWID forum. We will also have a pre-forum, which is going to be for funders, and there's a funder engagement journey around looking at feminist organizing and why it's important. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a spotlight there. And then finally, I think, there are lots of really interesting questions around, how philanthropy is providing INGOs with funding, and there's unequal pressures on community-based organizations. In fact, one of the questions is around how do we get behind the curtain of by invitation only? So for example, a lot of small nonprofits are not in some of the donor spaces or funder spaces, and that's a really, really important question. And other reflections around moving away from the charity model, We have a lot of folks who have raised the issue of disabilities, because obviously that specific issue is also historically, at least even in my country, looked at as more of a charity issue and not an issue that talks about the agency of people and the ableism in our world. So on that note, I just want to thank all of our speakers and all of the incredible audience here. You've all been so engaged and really shared a lot of your own reflections. And we will definitely, I think, share these back with you, because I think it's really great to see the breadth of questions. And I think we can also sort of get back to all of those who are in this webinar with at least some of the responses, and really want to appreciate all of the responses that our speakers gave us, to remind everyone to fill out the Where is the Money survey, and give a huge thanks to our speakers for their time, as well as the entire AWID team that is sort of in the background, making sure that this runs well, and to all our interpreters today as well. Thank you so much for stepping up. And I've actually been hearing seeing in the chat that our interpreters are doing a great job. So shout out to you, and thank you so much for joining. And we leave you with our little Where is the Money song. Hopefully you will be humming it or sharing it with your friends. And like I said, see you at the AWID Forum. And if you need any more information about the AWID Forum, you can visit our website on awid.org, and you can join as a member if you're not already. So thank you, Althea, Vanessa, Cindy, and Lisa. And we'll see you at the forum.
Bana bebede. Pesa kahan hai? Paisa kहाँ पी?
تنزل هويتنا بريتنا.
Where is the money? We gonna know. Where is the money?
Gdzie są pieniądze dla feministek?
Paisa kहाँ पी? Where is the money? We gotta know. We gotta know. আমাদের টাকা কোথায়?
Ere pesa.
Where is the money?
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day and evening. And
Thank you so much.
see you next time. See you,
Thank
Lisa.
you.
Thanks, Cindy. Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Althea.
Where